So this is a good question. I try a lot of different exercises. Some are difficult, of course, but some are easier. How do I determine if easier exercises are still worth doing so that I can prioritize others? In other words, how do I make sure I'm making the most of my recovery? This is an excellent question. So there's kind of like two concepts or mindsets that to keep in mind when you're trying to make this decision. One is if you are doing an exercise and you're doing it well and you can do it with good quality form for 10 to 12 repetitions, then I would say you've learned that movement. So you probably don't need to do that. Now, one thing I will add to that is you should be able to do it for 10 to 12, leave the activity, so move on to something else, come back to it, and be able to perform that movement exactly the same. That is how we test to see if someone's truly learned a movement, is we take them onto another activity and then come back to it. And if you can replicate it with relatively good form, then we would say you've kind of learned that movement. Now, there's one thing I'll say, and I kind of like to use like athletes, because we've all played sports, or probably most of us played sports when we were younger. There's always those foundational activities. You see it in the NFL, you see it in the NBA. They do those drills at the beginning of the game, and they never really change. Probably some of you recognize doing those drills when you were, in sports yourself. So I always say that there are some foundational movements that I think are beneficial for whatever you move on to, even if you only do like 2 or 3 of that movement. So, for example, reaching with the elbow immobilizer on and just reaching up, laying on your back is probably the easiest position to work on reaching. That's one activity that I do a few of with everyone, even if there's someone who's moving on to being able to reach overhead sitting up. Reason being, because I want them to feel that movement so that when we go to do the harder variation, they're not going to hike their shoulder up and compensate a lot when we try and do that same reaching activity sitting up. So that's an example of where you do a few of the foundations, so you don't eliminate that before you do the harder variation. So I would do that within each kind of training session. And then the other thing I would say is anytime you notice your form is changing, or you notice that, like let's take walking, for example, another example, using the legs. Let's say you've been crouch walking for a while and now you're pretty good at walking without your knee locking out. And now you go to Disney or you go into a loud, crazy environment and now your knee is locking out. Well, that just means that you probably need to do a little bit more of that crouch walking where you force yourself to walk with your knees bent as kind of a foundational activity a little bit longer, so that even though you're advancing your walking, you're still doing that foundation of the crouch walking. So that's just another example of where you're progressing, but you're still not totally eliminating some of those foundational movements.